Picture this. A young woman kneels at the altar in her white wedding dress, surrounded by roses she planted with her own hands. But instead of exchanging vows, she's about to die by royal command, murdered for the crime of loving a prince too deeply. This is the true story of Inês de Castro, who went from lady-in-waiting to secret queen, only to be executed in 1355 by her own father-in-law. Her forbidden love affair with Prince Pedro of Portugal was so dangerous that the king believed killing her was the only way to save his kingdom. But here's the twist that will give you chills. After her death, Pedro had her body exhumed, crowned her as queen, and forced his entire court to kiss the hand of his dead bride. Like and subscribe for more tragic love stories that changed history forever. The white silk veil still fluttered in the wind when the blade pierced through the heart of Inês de Castro, staining with crimson blood the altar where she had dreamed of becoming Queen of Portugal. It was January 7, 1355, and the church of Santa Clara in Coimbra witnessed not a wedding, but a murder that would echo through the centuries as the ultimate symbol of political cruelty disguised as reason of state. Inês was not merely a common bride being killed at the altar, but the center of a forbidden passion that threatened to topple kingdoms, destabilize alliances, and transform the Iberian Peninsula into a battlefield. Her death was ordered by a king who believed he was saving his nation, but who was actually condemning his own soul and creating a legend of love and betrayal that would inspire poets, playwrights, and dreamers for 700 years. Inês de Castro had arrived in Portugal as lady-in-waiting to Constança Manuel, the legitimate wife of Prince Pedro, heir to the Portuguese throne. She was a 20-year-old woman, daughter of a Galician nobleman, with hair black as a stormy night, and green eyes that seemed to contain all the secrets of the world. Inês was not exceptionally beautiful by the standards of the time, but she possessed a natural grace and penetrating intelligence that made her irresistible to men accustomed to women educated only to be silent ornaments. When she arrived at the Portuguese court in 1340, she had a single mission: to serve faithfully the future queen and remain invisible to the eyes of powerful men who could ruin her reputation and her life. The Portuguese court of the 14th century was a complex web of political intrigue, religious devotion, and social hierarchies that governed every aspect of daily life. Women of noble birth were expected to be paragons of virtue, educated enough to manage households and raise children, but not so learned as to challenge male authority. They were chess pieces in the great game of European politics, their marriages arranged to seal alliances, their children groomed to inherit not just titles, but the responsibility of maintaining delicate balances of power that could shift with a single diplomatic misstep. Into this rigid world came Inês, carrying herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength rather than mere breeding. She had been educated in the court of her uncle in Galicia, where she had learned to read Latin, speak French, and engage in the sophisticated conversations that were the hallmark of cultured nobility. But more than her education, it was her character that set her apart. She possessed an empathy that allowed her to understand the political currents swirling around her, a wisdom that enabled her to navigate court intrigue without compromising her principles, and a passion for justice that would prove both her greatest virtue and her ultimate downfall. The court ladies noticed her immediately. Some were drawn to her warmth and intelligence, finding in her a confidant who could discuss literature, philosophy, and the complexities of governing with equal ease. Others viewed her with suspicion, sensing that beneath her humble exterior lay a strength that could prove dangerous to their own positions. The men of the court were more subtle in their observations, but no less effective. Here was a woman who could engage them in intellectual discourse, challenge their assumptions without threatening their authority, and bring to their conversations a perspective that was both feminine and formidable. Pedro, Prince of Portugal, was a man of passionate temperament and impulsive nature, known for his thirst for justice and his inability to accept moral compromises. At 21, he had already married for political reasons to Constança Manuel, a union arranged to strengthen the alliance between Portugal and Castile, but which brought neither love nor happiness to either party involved. Constança was a sweet and kind woman, but without the spark of intelligence and passion that Pedro secretly desired in a companion. When he first saw Inês walking through the palace gardens with a book of poetry in her hand, he immediately knew he had found not just a lover, but the other half of his tortured soul. The prince had grown up understanding that his life was not his own, that his marriage, his friendships, Even his daily activities were all subject to the demands of statecraft. He had accepted this burden with the resignation expected of royal heirs, but deep within him burned a desire for authentic connection, for a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than political necessity. His marriage to Constanza, while politically advantageous, had only emphasized the emptiness of a life lived entirely for others' expectations. Pedro was also a man of deep intellectual curiosity. He had been educated by the finest scholars available to the Portuguese court, men who had studied in Paris and Bologna, who brought to their teaching the latest developments in philosophy, theology, and natural science. He spoke Latin fluently, could debate theological questions with learned priests, and had developed a particular passion for the works of the ancient philosophers. This intellectual foundation made him hunger for a companion who could match his interests, someone with whom he could explore ideas and share the burdens of leadership that he knew would one day be his. When Pedro encountered Inês, he found in her everything that had been missing from his life. She could discuss Aristotle's theories of justice as easily as she could analyze the political implications of a particular alliance. She understood the weight of responsibility that pressed upon him, but she also saw in him the man beneath the prince, the individual who struggled with doubts and dreams, just like any other person. Their initial conversations, stolen moments in palace corridors or chance encounters in the chapel, revealed a meeting of minds that was as rare as it was dangerous. The passion between Pedro and Inês began as a furtive glance during Mass, evolved into secret conversations in palace corridors, and finally exploded into a love that defied all social and political conventions of the time. They were not content with a discreet affair that might have been tolerated by the court, but plunged into a passion that consumed their entire lives. Pedro abandoned his duties as husband and heir apparent to spend entire days with Inês, discussing philosophy, poetry, and politics in an intellectual intimacy that was almost as dangerous as their physical intimacy. Inês, for her part, discovered that Pedro was not merely a lover, but a kindred spirit who shared her dreams of a more just and beautiful world. Their love affair unfolded against the backdrop of a Europe in transition. The 14th century was an age of great social and political upheaval, when traditional feudal structures were giving way to more centralized monarchies, when the Catholic Church was struggling with internal reforms and external challenges, and when the ideals of courtly love were both celebrated in literature and condemned by moral authorities. In this complex environment, the relationship between Pedro and Inês represented something revolutionary, a union based on genuine affection and intellectual compatibility rather than political expediency. They began to meet regularly in the palace gardens, where they would walk among the orange trees and discuss everything from the latest philosophical treatises to the practical challenges of governing a medieval kingdom. Inês proved to be not just a romantic companion, but a political advisor of remarkable insight. She had grown up observing the intricacies of court politics, and she brought to their conversations a perspective that was both feminine and strategic. She could analyze the motivations of various nobles, predict the likely outcomes of different policy decisions, and offer advice that was both morally sound and politically astute. Their relationship deepened when they began to correspond through letters, written in Latin, to ensure privacy, and filled with references to classical literature that served as a kind of code. These letters, many of which survived and were later discovered by historians, reveal the depth of their intellectual and emotional connection. Pedro wrote to Inês about his struggles with the responsibilities of his position, his doubts about particular policy decisions, and his dreams for what Portugal might become under more enlightened leadership. Inês responded with comfort, advice, and her own vision of a kingdom where justice and mercy could coexist, where the needs of common people would be considered alongside the demands of political necessity. When Constanza Manuel died in 1345, giving birth to the future King Fernando, many in the court expected Pedro to remarry for political reasons, choosing a foreign princess who would bring useful alliances to Portugal. Instead, Pedro shocked the nation by secretly marrying Inês de Castro, in an intimate ceremony that transformed a mistress into a queen and a bastard into the mother of future princes. The marriage was kept in absolute secrecy, but rumors spread through the court like fire through dry straw. Inês began appearing in public wearing royal jewels, being treated with the protocol due to a queen, and influencing political decisions in a way that made clear she was no longer merely a concubine, but a legitimate wife. The secret wedding took place in a small chapel outside Coimbra, attended only by a handful of Pedro's most trusted supporters. The ceremony itself was conducted by a priest who had been sworn to secrecy, and the only witnesses were men who owed their positions entirely to Pedro's favor. According to the few surviving accounts, Inês wore a simple white dress adorned with wildflowers, and Pedro appeared in the plain clothes of a country gentleman rather than royal regalia. They spoke their vows by candlelight, promising to love and honor each other regardless of the political consequences, and sealed their union with rings that Pedro had commissioned from a craftsman in Porto, designed with interlocking symbols that represented their joined destinies. The immediate aftermath of the secret marriage created a delicate situation that required careful management. Pedro could not publicly acknowledge Inês as his wife without creating a diplomatic crisis, but neither could he continue to treat her as merely a mistress. The solution was a kind of open secret. Everyone at court understood Inês's true status, but no one spoke of it directly. She began to participate in court ceremonies with a prominence that was clearly queenly, but her title was never formally announced. She started wearing jewels from the royal treasury, but they were presented as gifts rather than regalia. She began to influence political decisions, but her advice was sought privately rather than in formal council meetings. This arrangement might have continued indefinitely if not for the children. When Inês gave birth to her first son, Afonso, in 1346, followed by João in 1349, and Diniz in 1354, the political implications became impossible to ignore. These were not merely the bastard children of a prince's affair, but potentially legitimate heirs to the Portuguese throne. Each birth strengthened Inês' position and increased the threat she posed to the established order. The existence of these children meant that Pedro's secret marriage could not remain secret forever, and that the political crisis it would create was only a matter of time. Afonso IV, King of Portugal and Pedro's father, received news of the secret marriage like a dagger to the heart. He had spent decades carefully constructing Portugal's position in the complex web of Iberian alliances, and now he saw all his work threatened by his son's irresponsible passion. Inês was not merely an inappropriate matrimonial choice, but a political catastrophe that could drag Portugal into war with Castile, whose nobles viewed the Castro family as traitors and enemies. Afonso knew that if Pedro became king with Inês as queen, her children would inherit the Portuguese throne, creating a dynasty that would be unacceptable to the other Iberian kingdoms. The king's concerns were not merely theoretical. The Castro family had a complex history of shifting loyalties between Portugal and Castile, and their rise to power in Portugal would be seen by Castilian nobles as a betrayal of their traditional allegiances. Moreover, Inês's brothers and cousins held significant positions in the Castilian court, and there were legitimate fears that they might use their sister's position to influence Portuguese policy in ways that would benefit Castile at Portugal's expense. The potential for divided loyalties, for conflicts of interest and for outright treason was enormous. Afonso IV was also concerned about the internal stability of his kingdom. The Portuguese nobility had accepted the Castro family's presence at court as long as they remained in subordinate positions. But the elevation of Inês to queen would fundamentally alter the balance of power. Many noble families who had supported the monarchy for generations might find themselves displaced by Castro relatives and allies. The potential for civil war, for a fracturing of the delicate consensus that had maintained Portuguese independence, was very real. The international implications were equally troubling. Portugal's independence depended on maintaining a careful balance between the larger powers of Castile and France, playing them against each other while building alliances with smaller kingdoms like Aragon and England. If Portugal became dominated by a Castro dynasty with obvious ties to Castile, this diplomatic flexibility would be lost. Portugal might become, in effect, a satellite state of its larger neighbor, losing the autonomy that had been so carefully preserved over the centuries. The situation became even more explosive when Inês gave birth to 3 children by Pedro, Afonso, João, and Diniz. These children were not merely symbols of their parents' love, but living political threats representing an alternative dynasty that could challenge the established kingdom. Afonso IV saw his grandsons as dangerous bastards who might one day claim the throne against Pedro's legitimate children, creating a civil war that would destroy Portugal. Every innocent smile, every childish gesture from these children was interpreted by the king as a sign of future rebellion and political instability. King Afonso IV's advisors, led by Pero Coelho, Álvaro Gonçalves, and Diogo Lopes Pacheco, began pressuring the king to take decisive action against Inês. They argued that her presence at court was not merely a moral scandal, but an existential threat to Portuguese independence. "Your Majesty," Pero Coelho would say, "as long as this woman lives, Portugal will never have peace. She is a Castro, and the Castros serve Castile, not Portugal. Her children will be Castilian princes disguised as Portuguese, and when they inherit the throne, they will deliver our kingdom to our hereditary enemies." These words found echo in Afonso IV's deepest concerns, who saw in Inês not just an unwanted daughter-in-law, but an unconscious agent of national destruction. The three conspirators were men of considerable influence and unquestionable loyalty to the Portuguese crown. Pero Coelho was a veteran courtier who had served Afonso IV since the beginning of his reign, a man whose political instincts had been honed by decades of navigating the dangerous waters of medieval diplomacy. He genuinely believed that the Castro marriage represented a mortal threat to Portuguese independence, and he was prepared to take extreme measures to protect the kingdom he had served faithfully for so many years. Álvaro Gonçalves was younger, but no less committed to the Portuguese cause. He had risen through the ranks of the royal administration through merit rather than birth, and he owed his position entirely to his demonstrated competence and loyalty. For him, the threat posed by Inês was not just political but personal. If the Castro family gained control of the Portuguese court, men like him who lacked the right family connections might find themselves displaced by relatives and allies of the new queen. Diogo Lopes Pacheco represented the military perspective in the conspiracy. As a career soldier who had fought in several campaigns to defend Portuguese independence, he understood better than most the strategic implications of a Castro dynasty. He had seen firsthand how divided loyalties could weaken an army, how questions about leadership legitimacy could undermine military effectiveness, and how internal political conflicts could create vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Political pressure on Afonso IV intensified when Castilian ambassadors began arriving in Lisbon, demanding explanations about Inês's presence at the Portuguese court. Castile viewed the Castro family as traitors who had abandoned their original loyalty to serve Portuguese interests, and the idea that a Castro could become Queen of Portugal was seen as an intolerable provocation. Afonso IV found himself trapped between loyalty to his son and the responsibility to protect his kingdom from a war that could destroy generations of progress and prosperity. The Castilian position was complicated by their own internal politics. King Alfonso V of Castile was dealing with his own succession issues and noble rebellions, and he could not afford to appear weak in the face of what his courtiers viewed as Portuguese arrogance. The elevation of a Castro to the Portuguese throne would be seen as a direct challenge to Castilian authority, a suggestion that Castilian nobles could advance their fortunes better by serving foreign masters than by remaining loyal to their native kingdom. French diplomatic pressure added another layer of complexity to the situation. France had long-standing alliances with both Portugal and Castile, and French diplomats were concerned that a war between the two Iberian kingdoms could disrupt the delicate balance of power that kept English influence in check. French ambassadors visited both courts, urging restraint and offering to mediate any disputes, but their efforts only highlighted how serious the international community viewed the crisis. The papal court in Avignon also became involved, as church officials were concerned about the implications of Pedro's secret marriage for Catholic marriage doctrine. If the marriage were recognized as legitimate, it would set a precedent that could undermine the Church's authority over royal marriages. If it were declared invalid, it would create questions about the legitimacy of Inês's children that could lead to future succession disputes. Either way, the Church's interests were at stake, and papal representatives made their concerns known to all parties involved. The final decision was made in December 1354, when Afonso IV convened a secret meeting with his closest advisors. The discussion lasted for hours, with voices rising in passionate debates about justice, politics, and morality. Some advisors argued that Inês was innocent and that killing her would be a crime against God and humanity. Others insisted that she represented such a great threat to national security that her death was not only justifiable, but necessary. Afonso IV, a 60-year-old man consumed by the responsibility of protecting his kingdom, finally made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inês de Castro must die. The debate that led to this decision revealed the moral complexity of medieval statecraft. Those who opposed Inés's execution argued that she had committed no crime beyond loving a man and bearing his children. They pointed out that she had never shown any disloyalty to Portugal, that she had adapted to Portuguese customs and traditions, and that her influence on Pedro had generally been positive. They argued that killing an innocent woman would be a stain on the king's honor and a crime that would cry out to heaven for vengeance. The advocates for execution countered with arguments based on political necessity and national survival. They insisted that personal innocence was irrelevant when weighed against threats to the kingdom's independence. They pointed to historical examples of other rulers who had taken extreme measures to protect their realms, arguing that a king's first duty was to his people and his kingdom, not to individual justice. They suggested that allowing Inés to live would ultimately cost far more lives than her execution would save. Afonso IV himself was torn between these competing arguments. As a father, he understood Pedro's love for Inés and sympathized with his son's desire for happiness. As a man of faith, he recoiled from the idea of ordering the death of an innocent woman. But as a king, he felt the weight of responsibility for millions of subjects whose lives and welfare depended on his decisions. The sleepless nights he spent wrestling with this decision aged him visibly, and those close to him reported that he seemed to carry the burden of the entire kingdom on his shoulders. The king's final decision was influenced by intelligence reports suggesting that Castilian forces were mobilizing near the Portuguese border, apparently in preparation for some kind of military action. Whether this was actually related to the Inés situation or was merely routine military exercises, the reports created a sense of urgency that pushed the king toward the most extreme solution. He convinced himself that he was choosing between the life of one woman and the independence of his entire kingdom, and when framed in those terms, the choice seemed clear, if not easy. The execution was planned to appear like an accident or a crime by bandits, but the conspirators underestimated Pedro's determination to protect his wife. When they learned that the king had ordered Inés's death, Pedro and she fled to the monastery of Santa Clara in Coimbra, hoping that the sanctity of the place would provide some protection against royal fury. Inés spent her last days praying in the monastery chapel, caring for her small children, and writing desperate letters to Portuguese nobles who might intercede for her life. She knew she was doomed, but refused to abandon hope that Pedro's love would be enough to save her. The monastery of Santa Clara was a logical choice for sanctuary. As a religious institution, it offered the protection of canon law, which theoretically placed it beyond the reach of secular authority. The abbess was known to be sympathetic to courtly causes, and several nuns in the community had connections to noble families who might be willing to help. The monastery also had practical advantages. It was well fortified, it had multiple escape routes, and it was located in territory where Pedro had many supporters. During her final weeks, Inés displayed a courage and dignity that impressed even her enemies. She spent her days in prayer and contemplation, but she also used her time productively, writing letters to influential nobles throughout Portugal and even to foreign courts, appealing for intervention on behalf of her children, if not herself. These letters, written in her own hand in elegant Latin, revealed both her education and her political sophistication. She did not merely plead for mercy, but made reasoned arguments about the injustice of punishing innocent children for their parents' choices. Inés also spent considerable time with her 3 young sons, trying to prepare them for a future without her protection. She taught them prayers, told them stories about their Portuguese heritage, and tried to instill in them the values of courage, honor, and loyalty that would serve them well in the difficult years ahead. Witnesses reported that she spoke to them about their father with love and admiration, never allowing bitterness about her situation to color their understanding of the man who had brought both great joy and great danger into their lives. The atmosphere in the monastery during those final weeks was tense and sorrowful. The nuns were torn between their desire to protect a woman seeking sanctuary and their fear of royal displeasure. Some advocated for sending messages to other monasteries, hoping to create a network of religious institutions that could collectively resist the king's orders. Others argued for negotiation, hoping that some compromise might be reached that would save Inés's life while addressing the king's political concerns. On January 7, 1355, Pero Coelho, Álvaro Gonçalves, and Diogo López Pacheco arrived at the monastery of Santa Clara with an armed escort and a royal arrest warrant. Inés was in the chapel, kneeling before the altar with her 3 small children when the men entered. She did not try to flee or resist, but simply stood with dignity and asked if she could say goodbye to her children. Pero Coelho, touched by a moment of humanity, allowed her to kiss each child and whisper words of love in their ears. "Always remember that your mother loved you more than life itself," she murmured, not knowing these would be her last words as a free woman. The scene in the chapel was one of heartbreaking poignancy. The 3 children, too young to fully understand what was happening, clung to their mother's skirts as she knelt in prayer. The youngest, Dinis, was barely walking and kept reaching up to be held, while the older boys seemed to sense the gravity of the situation without comprehending its full implications. Inés's composure in these final moments impressed even the hardened soldiers who had come to arrest her, and several witnesses later reported that they saw tears in the eyes of men who had thought themselves beyond such emotion. The arrest warrant, read aloud in the chapel, charged Inés with treason, sedition, and endangering the security of the Portuguese realm. The language was formal and legalistic, but the charges were vague enough to encompass almost any action that could be construed as threatening to royal authority. This vagueness was intentional, designed to provide legal cover for what everyone understood to be a political execution rather than a judicial proceeding. As Inés was led from the chapel, she paused at the door to look back at her children one final time. The image of that moment, a young mother in white, framed in the doorway of a medieval chapel, reaching toward the children she would never see again, became one of the most powerful and enduring symbols in Portuguese cultural memory. Artists would paint it, poets would describe it, and storytellers would retell it for centuries to come. The procession from the chapel to the place of execution was witnessed by dozens of monks and nuns, as well as servants and visitors to the monastery. Inés walked with her head held high, her hands clasped in prayer, maintaining a dignity that contrasted sharply with the armed men surrounding her. Some witnesses reported that she seemed almost ethereal, as if she had already begun to transcend the earthly concerns that had brought her to this moment. Inés was taken to the monastery garden, where a crowd of monks and nuns gathered to witness what everyone knew would be an execution. She walked with her head held high, wearing a simple white dress that made her look like a bride on her way to the altar. When they reached the chosen spot, a small courtyard surrounded by rose bushes that she had planted with her own hands, Inés knelt on the stone ground and began to pray. Her words rose in the cold morning air like sad music, a prayer for her children's souls and forgiveness for her murderers. The garden where Inés met her death was a place she had helped to create during her time at the monastery. She had worked alongside the nuns to plant roses, herbs, and fruit trees, creating a space of beauty that reflected her hope for a peaceful future. The irony that she would die surrounded by the flowers she had planted with such optimism was not lost on the witnesses, and it added an additional layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking scene. Álvaro Gonçalves hesitated for a moment, moved by Inés's dignity and the tragic beauty of the scene. But Pero Coelho, hardened by years of political intrigue, drew his sword and approached the kneeling woman. "Inês de Castro," he said in a formal voice, "by order of His Majesty King Afonso IV, you are condemned to death for treason and sedition against the Kingdom of Portugal." Inés raised her eyes to heaven, murmured a final prayer, and waited for the blow that would end her life and begin a legend that would never die. The execution itself was swift, but not clean. The first blow struck her in the chest, but did not immediately kill her, and witnesses reported that she looked up at her executioner with an expression of forgiveness rather than hatred. A second blow finished what the first had begun, and Inés fell forward, her hands touching the petals of the roses she had planted, her blood mixing with the earth where she had dreamed of seeing her children grow up. She died within moments, but her death was only the beginning of a tragedy that would engulf the entire Portuguese royal family for generations. The immediate aftermath of the execution was chaos. Several nuns began weeping openly, and some of the monks began chanting prayers for the dead. The children, who had been kept in the chapel during the execution, began crying when they sensed something terrible had happened. Pero Coelho ordered that the body be buried immediately, without ceremony or honors, as if it were possible to erase the memory of a woman who had loved a prince and paid for that love with her life. When Pedro learned of Inés's death, his cry of pain was heard for miles around. He had not only lost the woman he loved, but also the mother of his children, his political confidant, and his intellectual companion. News of the execution transformed him from a passionate prince into a man thirsting for revenge, consumed by a hatred that would burn in his heart until the day he died. Pedro swore that he would make his enemies pay not only for Inés's death, but for every tear she had shed, for every moment of fear she had felt, for every word of love she would never again whisper in his ears. The civil war that followed was one of the bloodiest conflicts in Portuguese history. Pedro rebelled against his father, gathering an army of nobles who supported his right to marry whomever he chose and to avenge his wife's death. The battles lasted 2 years, devastating the country and causing thousands of deaths. Entire cities were burned, families were destroyed, and Portugal was divided between those who supported the king and those who supported the prince. The death of one woman had unleashed a national catastrophe that cost far more lives than any war her presence could have caused. The conflict revealed deep divisions within Portuguese society that had been hidden beneath the surface of royal authority. Many nobles who had remained silent about the Inés situation now chose sides based on their own political interests and personal loyalties. Some saw Pedro's rebellion as an opportunity to settle old scores or advance their own positions, while others genuinely believed in the justice of his cause. The result was a fragmentation of Portuguese society that would take decades to heal. When Afonso IV died in 1357, Pedro ascended to the throne as Pedro I and immediately began his systematic revenge against Inés's murderers. Pero Coelho and Álvaro Gonçalves were captured and executed in particularly cruel fashion. Pedro ordered their hearts to be torn out while they were still alive, a revenge he considered appropriate for men who had torn out Portugal's heart by killing Inés. Diogo Lopes Pacheco managed to flee to Castile, but Pedro sent assassins to hunt him down, and he spent the rest of his life hiding like a common criminal. The legend of Inés de Castro did not end with her death, but only began. Pedro publicly declared that he had married her in secret, and that she had been his legitimate wife, not his mistress. He ordered that she be buried as a queen, with all the honors due to a Portuguese sovereign. According to legend, Pedro had Inés's body exhumed and posthumously crowned, forcing the entire court to kiss the dead queen's hand in a macabre gesture that symbolized his eternal love and inconsolable grief. The tomb of Inés de Castro in the monastery of Alcobaça became a symbol of love that defies death and politics. Carved in white marble with extraordinarily beautiful details, the sarcophagus shows Inés as an eternally young queen, surrounded by angels and flowers, symbolizing her innocence and passion. Beside her rests Pedro, and according to tradition, the two tombs were positioned so that on Judgment Day, when the dead rise again, Inés and Pedro will look into each other's eyes for the first time since she was murdered at the altar of her dreams. The story of Inés de Castro inspired more works of art, literature, and music than any other episode in Portuguese history. Luís de Camões immortalized her in The Lusíads, calling her "she who after being dead became queen." French, Spanish, and Italian playwrights created theatrical works about her tragic love. Composers wrote operas that have made audiences weep for centuries. Painters created works capturing the terrible moment of her death at the altar, where she should have been crowned. Inés became a universal symbol of love that defies all conventions, and of how politics can destroy innocent lives in the name of reasons that seem important at the moment, but which history eventually reveals as cruel and unnecessary. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Inés's story is how it reveals the contradictory nature of political power. Afonso IV genuinely believed he was saving Portugal by ordering Inés's death, but his decision caused exactly the kind of instability and conflict he was trying to avoid. The civil war that followed cost more lives and caused more damage to the kingdom than any problem Inés's presence could have created. The king discovered too late that some political actions, even when justified by reason of state, create consequences worse than the original problems they intended to solve. The death of Inés de Castro at the altar, where she should have been crowned, remains one of the most powerful images in European history. A woman dressed in white, kneeling among the roses she planted, killed for loving a man she should not have loved, and for dreaming of a future she should not have dreamed. Her story reminds us that true love always challenges political and social conventions, and that those who try to destroy such love often end up destroying themselves. Inês may have died at the altar, but her memory became more powerful than any crown, more lasting than any kingdom, and more beautiful than any tragedy they tried to create by silencing her voice forever.